Well, I like to say that, my life has been a sequence of experiments.
When did you first realize that managing cloud costs isn't just about numbers?
How do you build data platforms? How do you build machine learning platforms?
Cloud cost optimization in general is a huge priority.
If you're thinking of doing anything related to machine learning or AI, your cost basis is going to be immense. Many things are now possible today that weren't feasible, let's say 10 years ago or even sort of like 5 years ago. Right?
Everything is changing so fast.
There are tools like Cloudgov that then sort of like provide that really deep visibility. The entire Gen AI wave is right sort of like in front of us.
First, just starting off, I know we're talking a bit about your beautiful, lovely background today, but so you are located in the Bay Area, San Francisco. So what brought you to the Bay Area from home? How'd you get started?
Yeah, so I think I've been now in the Bay Area for little over 12 years, like a few days and 12 years. I remember, I remember I started my first job out of school, 1st of October 2012. And so here we are, sort of like, a dozen years later. And it's actually really funny. I came to the Bay Area imagining that, I would be here for no more than 2 to 3 years. So I was also sort of like, more curious about what the Bay Area had to offer. One of the earliest piece of advice that I had gotten back when I was young was that, life is too short, so experiment with a variety of different things. This was in 2012, and there was the Google I/O, and they had launched Google Glass at that I/O, and they had like a really fascinating launch where they had like a bunch of skydivers wearing that Google Glass, and they jumped from a plane, landed right on the roof of Moscone, which is like a block away. And I was like, this is really cool. And they recorded that entire experience and biked onto the stage to meet sort of like Sergey and Larry. And I was like, okay, this is where technology is being built. This is where real change is happening. And I was keen to see for myself what that looked like. And that brought me to the Bay Area. And I thought that, okay, I'll sort of like stick around for a few years, learn a few things, see how startups work, how technology plays out. And then maybe I'll spend a few more years, maybe doing finance, maybe doing something else. But now it's been now more than 12 years and I'm still around.
Wow, that's awesome. Yeah, I know you mentioned it's been just about 12 years. Congrats on your moving anniversary. I know you graduated from college in 2012, right, with your degree in CS. And you mentioned working for like some bigger companies. I know you worked for Netflix and LinkedIn and Rocket Fuel at some point. So what really drove you to take the leap and leave that kind of like cushy software engineering world at a bigger company and then start Outerbounds with your co-founder in 2021?
Yeah. I mean, you can imagine, if you have to ever start a company, Bay Area is maybe perhaps one of the easiest places to do that. The entire ecosystem really pushes you to do something that is sort of like a lot more entrepreneurial. And as I'd mentioned before, just a sequence of different experiments. So I started my career at an early stage startup, saw firsthand what a rocket ship looks like. Then I went to a company that had gone public very recently, which was LinkedIn, which was very much sort of like lauded for the kind of infrastructure that they were building and their sort of like practice around data science. Then I moved to Netflix, which was basically sort of like, and still to this date, is well known for their rather unique culture. And I really wanted to experience what extreme ownership actually feels like. And then sort of like, a very natural sort of like progression was that, okay, let's sort of like dip my toes into the entrepreneurship pond and understand what does it take to really sort of like not only build technology, which you definitely get to do quite a bit when you are in big tech, but to really sort of like build a product, a company from the ground up. And of course, no better place to do that than San Francisco.
Absolutely. That's awesome. And what do you think was your role and inspiration during the creation of Metaflow? I know that's one of your big offerings at Outerbounds. Like, what inspired you to create that product in particular?
Well, I like to say that, my life has been a sequence of experiments. In many ways, I've also been quite lucky to focus on somewhat of a narrow discipline, which is all around like how do you build data platforms, how do you build machine learning platforms in the service of people who want to utilize data available in their organization. That's the work that I started out doing at Rocket Fuel, which was an ad tech company. Then I worked on the economic graph at LinkedIn, and then at Netflix, my team's role was to support all data science activities that Netflix was sort of like partaking in. And basically, it has given me sort of like this front side view or front row view into every massive change that has happened over the last decade or so, how sort of like, the world moved from whatever was the small data ecosystem to probably the big data ecosystem modeled around like Spark and Hadoop to sort of like, all the latest and greatest things that we see around HPC and sort of like Python driven systems. And that basically drove me and my co-founders to really sort of like figure out that, okay, what is this new world where given sort of like, all the new latest and the greatest hardware capabilities that we are seeing, all the advances that we are seeing in the open source community around new machine learning techniques, many things are now possible today that weren't feasible, let's say 10 years ago, or even sort of like 5 years ago. I mean, the entire Gen AI wave is right sort of like in front of us. We can clearly like who would have predicted that we would have AI chatbots which will be as performant as they are today, maybe even sort of like 5 years ago. But the problem that we were seeing many data scientists, many data practitioners run into was that things were just not easy enough to do. So things were
Right.
possible, but not easy enough. And there was this very big white space that most organizations were struggling with, where they had an immense appetite to do something with machine learning, something with AI, but then they were really sort of like struggling to achieve productivity as well as cost efficiency. And that's basically what drove us to start building Metaflow, which was the ML platform at Netflix. Then we open sourced it, and we soon found ourselves in a spot where many large enterprises started adopting Metaflow for their internal machine learning needs, and that generated a lot of demand for a company like Outerbounds to exist. And then we decided in 2021 to take the leap and start the company.
Well, and here you are 3 years later. That's amazing.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. So I know you mentioned a little bit like cloud cost optimization in general is a huge priority, which is kind of the focus of this particular conversation. And yeah, it's a very new development. The industry of FinOps is pretty much brand new in the scope of tech. I mean, pretty much everything is changing so fast, and now people are slowly coming to the realization that FinOps is an important aspect of building a product and building a company. So that's kind of what we're focusing on here at Cloudgov. So my first real question for you, when did you first realize that managing cloud costs isn't just about numbers, but is also a key component to driving success at your business in Outerbounds?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there was any specific moment per se. I mean, we are in the business of selling technology. So for us, every dollar matters. What we really sort of like care about is what is our dollar investment and how much can we sort of like drive value for our customers.
Right.
And the bigger the delta, the bigger is the economic case for Outer Bounds being a success story longer term. So that's the perspective that we take. Now, it is also a fact that if, let's say, as an organization, if you're thinking of doing anything related to machine learning or AI, your cost basis is going to be immense because GPUs are not inexpensive. Data systems are really, really tricky to manage and can sort of like, start getting really expensive at scale as well. And that basically then puts an onus on organizations to be really careful, really measured about their R&D investments on the machine learning side of the
Right.
house. And for us, the goal was twofold: that for our customers, how do we sort of like drive great visibility into the ROI that their machine learning initiatives might be resulting in, as well as for us, as we build this infrastructure, this platform for these customers, how do we ensure that we are maximally driving innovation for them?
Right.
So the way we sort of like think about these situations internally is that there's the cost of delivering a product or operating a product, and then there's a cost of building the actual service. So in like simpler terms, cost of servicing a customer, cost of building a product. And we want to make sure that we are sort of like at the forefront of innovation. And in that universe, when we are thinking about building a product, indulging in any kind of R&D expense, then it's not really sort of like, we are not as cost conscious at that particular moment because there's a lot of experimentation that needs to happen. While we are always careful about what is the economic basis of any architecture that we want to ship out, we also want to ensure that we are prioritizing innovation first and cost efficiency
Right.
second.
Yeah.
But then when it comes to servicing a customer, shipping something that sort of like actually lives in production and is delivered to our customers, then we do want to ensure that the value that our software generates for the customer, that's commensurate with the cost basis of the infrastructure that it runs on.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a huge thing that comes into play when navigating the FinOps and just trying to integrate it into the culture of a company because, innovation is always a priority over cost until you
Exactly.
kind of get to that breaking point when you realize like you need to start considering costs, especially when those costs start going up exponentially as you're using more and more, especially on an ML platform like Metaflow or Outerbounds. So on that note, how do you, as a leader and CTO, how do you navigate that kind of fine line between fostering innovation and trying to keep those costs under control? And how do you kind of instill that in your team of engineers?
Definitely, I wouldn't say that it's an easy balance to maintain. And what we have learned, at least sort of like within Outerbounds, is that extreme visibility helps.
Yeah.
So every engineer, every developer, they have a strong understanding of what any piece of infrastructure costs, any change that they ship to the platform, any R&D activity that they participate in, what is the actual infrastructure cost basis of that. And we try to make sure that all of these costs are contextualized. So the goal for us when we think about optimizing costs is never to figure out what is the minimum cost possible. The goal is for us to figure out that, okay, what is the net value that we can deliver to our customers? And in many cases, it's totally okay for us to spend more than what is comfortable to me personally on, let's say, GPU spend, so that, we sort of like can deliver extra value to our users, ensure that, our systems, our softwares can sort of like scale to our customers when they sort of like start operating at that scale. But then at the end of the day, of course, we run a business, so we are also very careful about our margins. So
Right.
wherever appropriate, then we also try to figure out very creatively what are some areas where we can indulge in sort of like, real sort of like aggressive cost optimization. And that's where having an understanding into what our architecture looks like, what are the different sort of like components and their cost profile, how does that scale? Um, it's an unfortunate reality that in today's world, cloud costs are a bit opaque. It's likely
Yeah.
that you ship an architecture and then lo and behold, somewhere something was misconfigured and now you're hit with sort of like significant data egress costs. And while your cost reports will definitely tell you that that is happening, even understanding where exactly that extra cost is coming from and how to actually sort of like go about and fixing it can be a big distraction. So any tools that sort of like, help us pinpoint any kind of leakage definitely helps then sort of like, the entire engineering team to be a lot more self-serve and confident in the decisions that they make, as well as move fast, which is basically sort of like the topmost priority for us.
Do you find that like fostering a culture of cost accountability and making teams feel like innovation is a priority while still kind of emphasizing the need for cost consciousness in certain areas? How do you foster that culture of prioritizing innovation and creativity while still instilling the background need to kind of keep the bottom line and ROI as tight as possible?
Yeah. So when we look at, let's say, our bottom line costs, right? They are basically in two buckets,
Right.
the human cost and the machine cost. And any time we are shipping any new functionality, one of the topmost priority is to basically figure out what is going to be the management overhead, maintenance overhead for any system, any feature that gets rolled out to our customers.
Right.
Because what I've seen happen over and over again is that teams start out with, let's say, maybe sort of like, 100% engineering bandwidth when they don't have any extra piece of software to maintain. And then slowly, as they sort of like continue shipping new features, then the overall fraction of time that they are devoting on any given day to maintenance activities, that starts to increase. And then lo and behold, you get to a point where most teams, what they are basically spending more of their time is just firefighting, attending to pager duty alerts, or like, servicing any sort of like specific customer ask that's coming in, rather than really sort of like taking a step back and rethinking what, let's say, the next tier of innovation that needs to happen. So
Absolutely.
we try to basically address that problem at the design phase of any project, because it's really important for us to also sort of like, ensure that we can keep our team sizes really small. Everybody has full context into what's being built, how it's being built,
Perfect.
how is the operational overhead going to evolve over a long period of time, as well as how machine costs are going to evolve over a longer period of time. It obviously doesn't make sense for us many times to invest in activities that will basically sort of like, that we don't stand a chance to sell to our customers for any kind of positive margin. I mean, that's
Yeah.
basically how sort of like most businesses operate. Whenever we have to make a decision between optimizing for human cost versus machine cost, then we always sort of like optimize for human costs because, of course, in like machine costs, you can also imagine that every single year, especially on the compute and storage side of the house, costs are falling down. So even if, let's say, many times we'll just be like, yes, let's run sort of like services with sort of like more resources, or let's maybe sort of like, be a tad bit more wasteful, just so that maybe we can sort of like save a few more extra precious engineering hours. And
Yeah.
that's a trade-off sort of like that we are happy to sort of like take on right now at our current scale.
Could you give another more specific example of how optimizing those cloud costs unlocks some potential for growth or reinvestment opportunities at Outerbounds?
Yeah. I mean, you know, um, so just to sort of like, give you a little bit more perspective around what our cloud footprint looks like. So Outerbounds is a machine learning platform that operates in a bring your own cloud model. So we run a single tenant control plane and service customers across all clouds. And what that means is that now internally at Outerbounds, we have hundreds and thousands of cloud accounts, each servicing a dedicated customer. And that's a lot of entropy, a lot of complexity that can be really hard to
Yeah.
manage.
Yeah.
And now also each of these customers, they also sort of like vary in terms of their scale of usage. So each of these control planes, they are also sized very differently, and everything sort of like, runs on top of intelligent autoscaler. So we don't have to spend a lot of time fine tuning our systems.
Right.
But even then, it becomes sort of like many times non-trivial for us to understand where exactly are we bleeding money, certain places where, it might be just like a tad bit more obvious for us to sort of like save costs. And one incident that I remember that sort of like, we were bitten by was that what many of the clouds have started to do is that if you don't very aggressively upgrade many underlying systems, then you are hit with these rather opaque extra charges for extended support plan for these systems. And those can be quite extreme at times. Many times, even in terms of communication, what I have observed is that many cloud providers, they're not sort of like really up to the mark in terms of communicating ahead of time that, yes, like this specific service that you're using, you may run into some sort of like extended support plan overages next month or next quarter.
Right.
And with CloudGov, we were actually able to get an early heads up that actually sort of like in many cases allowed us to slash our cloud bill by like 25-30%.
Wow.
And for a company of our scale, I mean, that's a meaningful spend that can be
Yeah.
put to much better use elsewhere as well. So those are like few areas where there are just like certain things that don't require much engineering input
Right.
from any of the team members. And it's mostly sort of like pressing some buttons at the right time that can save a lot of money. And we are more than happy to do that. And as and when
Yeah.
those opportunities are available, I mean, we are all up for sort of like, taking those up.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's kind of the big goal of CloudGov is to offer a solution to kind of like dial in those knobs to the optimized settings without requiring a lot of input and effort and engineering time from your team, which is precious to use for other resources. But I know you mentioned just trying to get everyone on the team to focus their energy on innovation while also optimizing those costs. Have you ever faced any pushback from implementing tools such as CloudGov or just trying to enforce some sort of optimization practices in general? Have you faced any internal resistance from your engineering teams, or and how did you kind of combat that as a CTO and leader of those engineering teams?
Yeah, excellent question. I think the pushbacks are always sort of like, at least in my opinion, many pushbacks are a function of how a particular practice or a tool is implemented in an organization, and less so about that specific practice or that specific tool per se.
Yeah.
And one sort of like, key tenet for the engineering group at Outerbounds is that we don't want sort of like any process to come in between any kind of innovation that we do. So we don't have any process for, let's say, like as an example, any engineer is completely free to go and spin up any cloud resources that they want. So we quite literally don't have very many governance policies around that. And that's by design, because we do want to sort of like ensure that there's a quick feedback cycle in terms of, let's say, if somebody deploys a big, massive infrastructure that sort of like results in an immediate cost spike, then people are alerted. And then we would want to sort of like go in and really sort of like triage what really sort of like happened there. And that also instills trust in the team, that it is sort of like an expectation that members of the team, they understand that they have access to all the tools and resources, and more importantly, they have trust of everyone around them to do the right thing. And there are tools like CloudGov that then sort of like provide that really deep visibility into how that infrastructure is sort of like stitched up, and what is the impact on cloud expenses for us.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
with that approach, there hasn't been sort of like any pushback per se. On the contrary, before CloudGov, we would basically sort of like, look at our expenses, let's say at a weekly cadence. And it used to be a really sort of like manual exercise. And many times people used to detest that because, of course, if you're running like 100 plus cloud accounts,
Yeah.
and even figuring out what is an anomaly, how do you figure out that, okay, this is an anomaly, what resulted in that anomaly? That's really painful, that's really manual.
Yeah.
And when we brought CloudGov in, that automated that entire setup for us. What we also really appreciated was the fact that, just getting to work with the CloudGov team, where they are able to pour into all our billing reports and dashboards and really highlight scenarios that would have been really difficult and complex for us to sort of like, look into. So we really appreciate that extra level of visibility, that extra level of white glove support that we get from the team, which just goes beyond the product that they have built.
It's great to hear that you've had a good experience with the product. And yeah, I think there's a lot of misconceptions about cloud cost optimization and keeping track of those anomalies. I know a lot of people kind of rely on those native tools like Cost Explorer or similar native tools that kind of give you a less in-depth view of cloud cost management. So what do you think is the biggest misconception that people have about cloud costs, and cloud cost management as a CTO that you've encountered?
The goal is never to sort of like minimize costs to the bare minimum. The goal is always to sort of like, keep costs in check, contextualize any spend that might be happening. And the tools that are provided by cloud providers themselves, they basically provide you visibility into like, hey, here's basically where the spend is going. And that's sort of like in many ways broken down by specific infrastructure and specific products that you might be using. But then there's a very different taxonomy that any organization sort of like, will have for themselves. So as an example, you may have certain spend that might be devoted to research activities. That's purely speculative, and it's really hard to sort of like optimize on that spend sort of like ahead of time, and it's also never sort of like recommended per se. And then there might be some spend that is sort of like very steady state, where there might be opportunities for optimization. Now, if I take this as an example, right, like if let's say in the machine learning universe, if somebody is playing with a really large model, which can sort of like, stretch into terabytes at times, of course, your S3 bill is going to be high, but that's okay, maybe, right? And maybe you have your product, which is sort of like in production that also uses S3. And maybe you want to optimize S3 spend for that specific usage. But now if you go to your cost explorer, then it can be sort of like really tricky to figure out that the S3 spend that you see, how much of that is driven by your research activities and how much of that is driven by your production activities.
Right.
And is that even a cause for concern or not? So just being able to layer your own taxonomy, your own sort of like worldview of like, hey, this is what my internal architecture looks like. And here are the subsections of my S3 spend that I really care about that needs to be optimized. And here is everything else that I'm okay not really worrying about today. Maybe I would want to worry about it, let's say, like 2 months down the road. But let's sort of like, keep it away. That's the level of visibility that's usually a lot more important. When we used to pour over our own cost explorer reports, we would basically like the goal always would have been like, oh, let's look at this spend. Oh, that spend was because we were running sort of like this experiment. So let's not sort of like, worry too much about this cost, or let's look at this other experiment. Hey, we had a bug here. So we expect that, yes, there was this overage and it's not really sort of like actionable for us. And what is that narrow slice that sort of like tells us that, okay, here is the actionable spend. And here's basically the next step that you need to take to really sort of like save on that spend. I mean, those are the few things that are really, really helpful for us. Another thing that Cost Explorer didn't really surface for us too well was unused resources or dangling resources, right? Many times, I mean, software fails for many different reasons. We live in the world where, especially on the compute side, most organizations, including ours, we frequently experiment with different kinds of autoscalers, and no autoscaler is perfect. Many times you have a dangling compute instance, and Cost Explorer will never highlight that until unless you know that, like that node should not exist, but it exists, then you would sort of like, really identify that and you will turn that instance off. But if you're running a fleet that is measured in thousands of different nodes spread across hundreds of different accounts, then it's just like humanly not possible for any of us here at Outerbounds to sort of like keep a track of that.
Exactly.
And Cloudgov is able to basically bundle an insight around like, hey, are these resources, these cloud resources actually being used or not? And then that sort of like, surfaces it up for us. And then we are able to very quickly eyeball whether any corrective action needs to be taken care of. And we have hooked it up to PagerDuty, where if we detect that, yes, we are running into an overage that's sort of like beyond some minimum comfort level, then people are alerted and then we're able to take a quick action to stop that bleed.
Yeah, absolutely. I think like the way that you use CloudGov is really kind of the penultimate usage of the tool, since you have so many cloud accounts connected, and it's just saves so much time to be able to have those pre-ready integrations and alerts set up as well, so you can just eliminate all that time wasted on trying to find where things are. And yeah, thanks for pointing that out about Cost Explorer as well. I think that's a big misconception in the industry, is that you don't need anything beyond native tools, and you don't need anything beyond native tools, but it can make your life a lot easier. I wanted to ask, what's your future goals for Outerbounds, and how do you see the FinOps industry and Cloudgov playing a role in achieving those big goals for Outerbounds?
Yeah. I mean, definitely on the FinOps side of the house, one of the critical goal that most organizations who invest any dollars towards machine learning and AI are always sort of like curious about is what is the ROI
Right.
at the end of the day, right? Because basically, machine learning and AI, where they sort of like shine the best, is providing a last mile solution for any kind of business optimization that any enterprise would be interested in. And where I'm sort of like most excited on the FinOps side is how do we sort of like surface to our customers, customers of Outerbounds, that the amount of money that they are spending on cloud resources as well as human capital expenditure, how does that sort of like correlate to the returns that they might be seeing on their top line? And then basically coming to, let's say, CloudGov and sort of like, many other tools in the space, their impact on sort of like our own ecosystem is that it has just made our own life in terms of being able to ship software for a much lower cost basis a lot more easily achievable. I think over the last sort of like 12 months, we have been able to reduce our total cloud cost across R&D and production spend by 50%, while we have hired more engineers, while we have onboarded more customers, while we have experimented with even more sort of like, larger number of resources. So that's sort of like a win-win scenario where we never have had to cut back on any of our engineering spend, any of our engineering projects, and we have been able to sort of like accelerate our engineering velocity while at the same time lowering our infrastructure cost. So I couldn't be more happier.
That's amazing. I'm so happy to hear that. And I'm so happy to hear that CloudGov could play a role in your success at Outerbounds. That's so awesome. And it's been so great to hear more about the details of what Outerbounds does for their customers and the details kind of about how you got here to personally being one of the co-founders and CTO at Outerbounds. So I'll get into some quick rapid fire questions now that we're getting closer to the end. So first of all, I know you mentioned you came to the US after graduating with a CS degree, but if you weren't in the tech world, what career do you think you would be pursuing right now instead?
Very interesting question. I mean, many times I've thought about this myself. And so I'm a history buff. So I would say that if I wasn't in tech, then I would love to just like, spend my time being a docent at museums. I think I love learning about history. I love educating other people
Yeah.
about history. So I think that would be a really cool gig.
Yeah, that's awesome. I've honestly thought about that too. Like, I live in Boston, and there's a cool history here. I mean, as well as in the Bay Area, and California has an interesting history as well. But yeah, that's one of my favorite things to do is like go to museums on the weekends. So
Yeah,
that's cool.
yeah.
That's a really interesting answer. I wouldn't have expected that about you. And kind of on that note, if you could give your younger self, like just graduated in 2012, one piece of advice, what do you think you would tell a younger version of Savin?
Yeah, I mean, just take more risks, to be honest. I think all of us don't realize sort of like the I think when you live in, let's say, a place like Bay Area and all the possibilities that it affords us,
Yeah.
I think it's the easiest place in the world to take risks. So I'm sort of like a big believer in like yeah, it's mostly sort of like let's sort of like maybe you can edit this out. But yeah, it would be more about like just taking more risks.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you took a big risk by leaving like a very reliable and comfortable position at a big tech and just starting your own business at Outerbounds. And I mean, here you are. So who's to say? Maybe if you started 10 or 5 years earlier, you'd be an even more crazy place. So yeah,
Yeah, yeah, who knows?
it's weird to think about the past, and like I try not to like think about what I could have done differently, but it also kind of helps you plan for the future and what you want your own future to look like. So, I mean, I'm excited to see the future of Outerbounds and also Cloudgov. I think it's great that we can have that like cooperative experience and relationship between the companies, and it's really cool to see how much you've grown even just within the last 3 years. I think that's
Mhm.
amazing that the Bay Area is a great place to be doing that as well.
Yeah.
And another question I have for you, where do you think is the weirdest place that you've had a great idea or like inspiration struck you in an unexpected space?
I find that when I apply myself to a problem for multiple hours at a stretch, and go really, really deep into it, that's when sort of like true inspiration strikes. The easiest place that I find to actually focus on any problem very deeply is whenever I'm driving. So that's always sort of like, been a interesting facet for me. If
Yeah,
I'm struggling with a problem, something that's just eluding me many times, I'll just like go out on a long drive that allows me to sort of like clear my mind and sort of like think about the problem in a very different light. I'm big into running, so that's yet another sort of like place that allows me to really sort of like just solely focus on one specific problem at hand. And
yeah,
usually after a race, sort of like much better, well informed about sort of like, whatever is the greatest problem that I'm struggling with at that
yeah.
moment.
Yeah, I totally agree. At least like running as well. I know running in San Francisco might be tough because there's a lot of big hills, but it's so nice to just kind of be outside. And I agree with that, that the just being completely outside of your regular environment and feeling very in tune with your mind is one of the best benefits of running, I think so. And one other question, maybe a quick plug, but what is one cost optimization tool that you would say that you can't live without at Outer Bounds?
Yeah, I mean, definitely very happy with Cloudgov so far. My fundamental belief is that any company, especially in the FinOps space, I mean, two things matter the most. What is the quality of the product, and what is the support that you get alongside the product? And we've been happy on both of those fronts. We have tried other solutions in the past. Many times we're happy with the product, not at all happy with the support, or we're happy with the support, but the product was not at all where it needed to be. And with CloudGov, I feel that we have sort of like a healthy balance of both.
Awesome. I'm so happy to hear that from you. And I just have a couple more questions really quick. I know we're getting close to the end here, but what would you say is one word to describe the future of cloud optimization and cloud cost industry?
I would say that, in many ways, serverless is the future. And when I say serverless, I think of it more as an economic model where the cost basis is quite literally sort of like focused on usage, which is basically what a bulk of our cost optimization efforts are also centered around that. How do we minimize wastage? How do we bump up resource utilization as much as possible? And as we sort of like, enter into a world where serverless offerings for compute storage are sort of like a lot more easily accessible and performant, then that should sort of like, really help get to a universe where companies can afford to have a really sophisticated FinOps strategy right off the gate.
And my very last question for you, Savin. What's one book or movie or any sort of media piece that shaped you and kind of your thinking as a leader in the tech industry that you would recommend someone else to read that would like to be in a similar position that you are in now?
I think one book that I really admire is Shackleton. So it's the biography of Ernest Shackleton, who made a voyage to the South Pole. and everything that sort of like transpired during that voyage. And it's a really nice book that sort of like, dives deep into when things are not necessarily on the up and up, then how do you react? Which I think is the biggest lesson that sort of like, is important as you go down the path of, let's say, building your own company in many ways.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the way that you react to challenges and things not going your way is kind of how other people perceive you and how you define yourself as a leader. So that's
Yes.
good. I'll have to check out that book, but
Yes.
thanks for the recommendation. Before I stop recording, thank you so much, Savin, for agreeing to be a guest on our FinOps podcast series for Cloudgov. I think you had some amazing insights that I will personally be taking with me. I really thought your advice was insightful, and I was so happy to hear that you're enjoying the Cloudgov product at Outerbounds. But thanks again so much for joining us, and I hope I speak with you again soon.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This was really fun.
Yeah, I had a lot of fun talking with you, and thanks so much for giving really insightful and thought out answers to my questions. I think you had amazing responses to everything I asked, so thanks so much.